Hello, hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 3628. Today's date is October 7, 2025. It's been almost like a morning at 7:48 a.m. Lately, I am like there is a couple of things that I'm facing problems. Okay. First of all, is that the content execution. Yesterday I thought that I don't know, yaar, yesterday was like little bit of mistake happened. I couldn't able to make my content and yeah, whatever. So I'm kind of like a managing my time, utilize my time for um, as much as efficient as possible as I can. But every time I try to utilize it, just okay. Whatever. Let's just these are kind of like only daily challenges that I have to be face. Okay. Um, Important thing is that I was not really prepared for surprise stuff. Okay. Last night I went to my friend house for this kojagiri, and because of this thing I didn't really able to record artifact. I didn't really did any kind of like assembly stuff after I did ate my dinner. So I thought that the remaining kind of like a remaining kind of like a work should supposed to be done after the end of the dinner, but probably this didn't happen. And yeah, another thing, I'm kind of like a little bit of something really something that he upset. Is it upset? Yeah, upset about that I am kind of like losing the follower on Instagram platform. From like last month I lose almost like a 200 follower on Instagram platform, which is like really wrong. Yeah. uh, like a couple of months ago, means like last month I have 13,000 follower. Today I have 12,800 follower, which is really suck. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people are kind of like something unfollowing me and stuff like that. I need to find a reason, and I found the reason. What exactly reason is that? Okay, and try to make sure my content as good as possible as I can. Okay. All right, so let's just jump right into the question. Yeah. All right. Yeah, let's go. Okay, question is, what if 3D printing created an entire city? Okay, that's a really good question. Okay. First of all, what exactly is this question, and why am I asking this question to myself? This is a what if question. Okay. I am asking this question to myself is because of that what if question is kind of like a always create a kind of like a only such a reality that I am creating that reality. It kind of like only force you to think in that way. It it is it felt really good while giving the answer. It is really good. Yeah. Disclaimer: the information that I'm trying to tell you in this answer is not exactly right, or is not exactly wrong either. It's a it's a kind of like only the raw. It's unfiltered. It's yeah, you get what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, yeah. So the main purpose of this, so that I would express my thoughts um, without having any kind of like a only judgmental regarding about my thought is actually right or wrong. Okay. Okay, so should we jump? Alright, yeah. So what if like um, cities are made by 3D builder machine or things like that? Like, is it exactly the question is that? What if 3D printing is created by entire city? 3D printing. Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, first of all, let's just understand what is actually 3D printing. Okay, yeah. Let's just understand first of all printing. A printing means like that you print a particular data on page. Okay, uh, Xerox copy or any kind of like a thing that is called print. That is 2D. That means two dimensional. That means like you could kind of like a simply just like a scene on paper. Okay, yeah, there is no 3D at all. 3D means like that a kind of like a three dimensional where kind of like a simply the look at around yourself. You not only kind of like look at your hand. Okay, your hand is a 3D. Okay, everything is actually in front of you is a 3D. You not only kind of like a see the touch and everything, but 3D is kind of like a gives them a not only height but width and things like that, so that you could look at that particular stuff from every angle possible point of perspective. Okay, yeah. So 3D printing is a kind of like a some print a material in 3D way. Okay, yeah. In in 2D printing, usually kind of like a printer could print only in 2D way. A Xerox copy or printer is print only in 2D way. A 3D printer could print kind of like a simply object in 3D way. By the way, we have a 3D printer. It's not really that this technology does not exist. This technology exists. We are actually printing some of the kind of like a stuff, which is good, which is great. Okay, yeah. Now, what if imagine that a 3D printer could print the entire city? Then what would be that reality? Um, Probably that city would be really good. Okay, yeah. First of all, is that the time required to make that city was really less. One thing. Another thing is that the resources required to build that city is also less. Okay, yeah, because the conventional way of making cities is kind of like a wasting a lot of resources. But a 3D printer can kind of like a manage the resources very carefully and utilize it for very right way. Okay, yeah. uh the the everything the making of kind of like a cities are way much faster. Okay, yeah. And also cheaper too. Okay, yeah. uh, because of there is no kind of like a simply labor involved, everything is actually happened by automatically, so obviously the prices of the houses went down. The houses will be so affordable. Okay. um this is kind of like a stuff will gonna happen. Obviously it's a really good. Okay, yeah. Okay, we not only kind of like a simply create just a box shape of kind of like a building and things like that. If we have a 3D printer, we could build up buildings with more aesthetic, more creative curve, bend, lot of kind of like some creative buildings that we could build from 3D builder, which is really good, which is really great. So yeah, then why are we not? Okay, why are we not kind of like a building that stuff? Well, let me tell you one thing. Now, a 3D builder or 3D printer is like basically is this thing. Yeah, we actually invented that technology. We have a 3D printer. We are actually kind of like a print particular object, but kind of like a building the cities and things. We are really far away from that. Really, really far away. Okay, yeah. Because of that, when we build any kind of like a simply building or any kind of like a houses, we are not just using only cement and things like that. We use multiple materials. Okay, yeah, iron rods or kind of like a wirings or kind of like a bricks and stuff and things like there is a lot of. I'm not saying is that it's not really difficult, but like basically is this thing. I don't know, dude. Like basically at the time implementing this 3D technology to build some sort of house, it's something that keep probably little bit expensive or things like that probably at the moment at the early stage. And this is somewhat true, by the way, because when there is a new technology that actually arrive, the the accessing that technology is kind of like a bit really expensive. So yeah, but simultaneously that technology would be kind of like it's only very much easy to use and probably this would be our reality, that most of the cities and kind of like houses are kind of like built by 3D printer. There is a kind of like some example. Sorry, there is a kind of like something. I'm not really sure, but a government kind of like some office, a post office is actually kind of like a printed by 3D printer. Okay, yeah. A couple of years ago, they have kind of like a somebody. I'm talking about in India. Okay, yeah. In India, there is a kind of like a somebody a post office actually kind of like a creately like a basically is made by 3D printer, which is like a really good, really great. Okay, yeah. It's a kind of like a really ambitious project, and kind of like a government of India execute that project really well. Okay, yeah. So it's good. There are multiple kind of like assembly 3D printer projects, like a 3D printing kind of like a construction is actually happen all around the world, which is good and great. But still, is this thing na ki what I'm trying to tell you is this thing is that ki when we build any kind of like a building, or when we build any kind of like assembly houses or things like that, we are not just building for like basically is this thing na ki we are make sure that houses or that building should supposed to be survive at least thousands of years. Oh yeah. So we build our kind of like assembly whatever it is in that particular way. A 3D printer is not actually giving that guarantee. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that like whatever you could build, it might kind of like build for maybe 200 year or maybe 500 year, but more than that it's not. What I'm trying to tell you is this thing that there is a lot of science is actually involved over there. Okay, yeah. Like basically is this thing what is at least strength and things and that it's a lot of stuff. Okay, yeah. There is a one thing. Another thing is that ki probably is this thing in our world we already have so many cities. Okay, yeah. That could cater almost like a millions or billions of people. Why do we supposed to kind of like make a such a cities, another cities that would be kind of like a somebody even more like like what I'm trying to tell you is this thing that na ki like I'm not really against to kind of like build the cities and things like that, but when we build the cities we kind of like deforestation happen, like it's lot of stuff happened that kind of like might not good for kind of like a green and things like that. By the way, I might kind of like be wrong because of that key probably if we kind of like build this kind of like 3D building or 3D cities, we might kind of like a design that city in a such a way that as a kind of like a nature and kind of like a concrete jungle would kind of like sustain together. Probably we have kind of like room for garden or things or that. It would be really good. It would be really great. Okay, yeah. So yeah, things is always gonna happen really like basically is this thing if I'm kind of like looking at the 3D printing or 3D kind of like a building or 3D construction things like that, the possibilities of kind of like a what went wrong is very less. Yeah, like basically is this thing that the only thing that we really require to understand how this technology work and how do we supposed to utilize it for kind of like the right purpose and things like that. Okay, yeah. So basically this technology is really good, really great. It kind of like somebody add a gift for you humanity and stuff like that. So yeah, probably. And within a future we might have kind of like somebody 3D printing and things like that. But also let me tell you one thing. There is a one weird fact, a kind of like a wrong fact regarding about 3D printing. Okay, yeah. Yes, a 3D printing is kind of like a really good for kind of like a really managing resources. A 3D printer is really good for kind of like a completely complete the entire building within a kind of like a limited amount of time, which is also really good too. What is actually problem? What kind of like this stuff? Well, let me tell you one thing. In like if we wanted to kind of like somebody any kind of like 3D printer, yeah, we are kind of like a building objects or every kind of like somebody whatever it is in 3D, but we are not kind of like somebody utilizing like we are not kind of like somebody print that model in 3D way. Okay, what is actually this thing? What I'm trying to tell you? Okay, yeah. Okay, it's very hard to understand, but it's not really hard to understand. Oh yeah, let me try to give you kind of a couple of stuff. Okay, yeah. Have you ever seen a 3D printer or have you ever seen the way that 3D printing is actually work? If you could imagine that particular stuff, then it would be really easy for you. But still, I'm trying to explain as simple as possible as you can. Imagine you have to kind of like a print a sphere. Okay, yeah. Sphere is a kind of like a circle. It's a sphere. It kind of like you have to kind of like create a globe. Okay, yeah. So how do you supposed to do it? How do you supposed to kind of like a print that particular sphere? So probably is this thing, my needle will kind of like simply point it at one direction, and it kind of like simply round and round and round and round. So basically it round things, and basically it creates sphere, right? So is it actually happen exactly like that way? No, it's not actually happen like that way. Why? Because let me tell you, when you try to create a sphere, okay, yeah, a sphere is a kind of like a circle, in 2D way circle, but in 3D way it's a sphere. That kind of like a object really required a support from bottom up. Okay, yeah. And basically that support is also kind of like a created by 3D technology. Okay, yeah. You cannot create object without support. Okay. So basically what does 3D printer do is that a 3D printer is not only create that circle and circle, it also create that support too, a supporting system, so that sphere should supposed to be maintain his rigidity at its place, so that needle can kind of like assembly do his work. By the way, needle means like that there is a pointer where kind of like assembly the material is actually came out, and it kind of like assembly pour over there, layer by layer, layer by layer, layer by layer. Alright, so this is the way that a 3D printer print a sphere. It really requires support. Okay, yeah. Now, if I'm trying to say support means like that, it lot of resources. It takes lot of resources. As I mentioned, that 3D printer is kind of like somebody consume less resources, but in this time at the technology that we have, it kind of like somebody we are spending so much amount of time and spend to resources, that resources should supposed to be eliminated after we create that particular sphere. Okay, if you not really kind of like imagine this particular stuff, okay, yeah, just look that kind of go to the YouTube, okay, yeah, and kind of like look at 3D printer and things like that. Okay, yeah, a 3D printer kind of like assembly layer by layer, it kind of like creates the kind of like assembly object, but that layer should supposed to be support system, that support kind of like made by 3D printer too. Okay, and that is the biggest problem. Now basically the sphere that we are trying to make is very small sphere, let's just say almost like a just couple of inch, and the support really required is a kind of like a little less, so that we could kind of like eliminate that support as much as easily as could. But since we kind of like only move to bigger object, then that support system should supposed to be get much more bigger too, and probably removing those kind of like a support system, it's, but why do we really require support system now? Okay, imagine sphere is a kind of like a sphere na, like can you imagine a sphere, a 3D circle? Okay, yeah, a 3D circle can kind of like if I just put on the plane, it would kind of like rotate, and it would kind of like change its position, right? It's changes position, so we need a kind of like a support that it would not move anywhere at all. Okay, yeah. Now if we kind of like a pre-applied support, then probably this thing it not work very properly, because the needle is kind of like basically that pre-applied support will kind of like create disturbance for needle, because needle should supposed to be move freely. When the needle will move freely, only and only then it kind of like create that particular 3D object. So what I'm trying to tell you is this thing, we cannot pre-applied that support, and basically is this thing, the sphere is not kind of like somebody just it start from the beginning, it layer by layer it kind of like a create. So basically is this thing, as a needle, as a 3D printer should supposed to be create the support first, a kind of like a such a support that kind of like a really required to support just initial part of kind of like a sphere, and slowly the needle will kind of like a create the base and things, and it also kind of like a create another support system to another pillars, so that sphere should supposed to be kind of like a maintain the rigidity, maintain is kind of like it will not move and things like that, so that needle will kind of like a work really well. Now how these things actually happen, why do we really require support? for gravity. Okay, because most of the kind of like a 3D printer that we have, we are utilizing in our planet, in our earth, and our earth has a gravity. Because of the gravity, needle can kind of like a somebody cannot move in 3D dimension. Why? Because it's not okay. Because if I try to kind of like a somebody move our needle in kind of like a 3 dimension, the material would kind of like a somebody come out and it went down because the gravity. Okay, yeah. So basically, is this thing, the 3D printer is very efficient, like inefficient in kind of like assembly in our planet. Okay, yeah, in our planet. But a 3D printer is way more efficient in one place, and it could kind of like create so many objects so fast, so easily without any support and things like that. Can you guess what is that space? That space is a space, buddy. I'm talking about out of our planet, a kind of like a simply a space station. Like a basically, if we install a kind of like a simply 3D printer on ISS International Space Station, then probably we don't really require any kind of like a support system. Nothing really at all. A needle not only can move from X to Y direction, it kind of like a went to Z direction too. The needle can went to Z direction, and without any kind of like a support, we could create that kind of like a sphere. Far easy, far good, less material, very efficient. Okay. So what I am trying to thinking, like what is actually my thought process? Probably is this thing, the 3D printer that we have at the moment, we might not gonna utilize that 3D printer to kind of like build the cities or build the building or things and that because it's way more expensive. Way like it's inefficient. Like a basically it is less efficient to conventional way, but still it is inefficient. Okay, yeah. And another thing is that the technology that we have is kind of like simply undeveloped at the moment. Okay, yeah. But since we move forward, the probably the effective way to utilize the 3D printer in space. Okay, yeah. And this is a kind of like basically is a 3D printer, like a basically what exactly happened in kind of like assembly in our planet. Probably it's far more kind of like a difficult to do it, but in kind of like a space, a needle, not only the needle but entire 3D printer can move um, in every direction of the object, so that it could kind of like a print that particular object, every direction, x y z axis and things like that. So probably is this thing, it would kind of like solve multiple problems. What kind of like a problem? Like basically is this thing, whatever we are kind of like a building on space, like a ISS or any kind of like a satellite or things like that, we actually made those things on our planet. Okay, yeah. And then we launched that particular object into the orbit, and then it kind of like a work. But what if we could create our own satellite over there? Okay, yeah, over the space. Like basically imagine a kind of like assembly a kind of like assembly a construction machine that kind of like construct these spaceships, spacecraft, satellite and things like that on the space, because it's way more effective. It's way more effective and things like that, because the transportation cost would be really reduced. Because of that, probably let me tell you one thing, the cost really required to kind of like a send some sort of object, a 1 kilogram of kind of like a some object from surface to space, it's so much expensive. But what if we could kind of like create a particular 3D printer on a space that could kind of like create the entire everything, like a spaceship, spacecraft, ISS, god knows what you want, it could create by itself. But dude, what about material? Material should supposed to be like a bring out, na? Dude, the space is actually filled with lot of material, lot of material, dude. We just kind of like take any kind of like a meteor or things like that, and we just kind of like do it. Okay, yeah. At the beginning we might really require kind of like some such a material that we could kind of like simply send that material from space to space, sorry, surface to space. But it's not really feasible at all. We need to find a material over the space, and probably space is actually filled with lot of material, a lot of stuff is actually included over there. We can utilize that thing. Okay, yeah, probably at the beginning it's not really exactly the way that it should supposed to be, but throughout the technology we might kind of like assembly improving the way that we should supposed to build a lot of spaceships, spacecraft and things like that. What I'm trying to tell you is this thing: a space is a really kind of like assembly of fertile land for 3D printer to print spaceship, spacecraft, satellites, or god knows what you could make, right? Whatever. Okay, yeah, this is kind of like something happen in the future. Okay, yeah, I should supposed to be end here. So there's it isn't and 3D cities would be really good. Yeah, thank you.